Welcome to Secret Sound. I'm your host, Matt Marble. Join me as we explore the hidden history of American music. With each episode, I'll be highlighting fascinating yet marginalized composers from the fringes of American memory, as well as new perspectives on a few well-known artists. We'll also be exploring some of the esoteric traditions that influence these artists, like Theosophy, astrology, Enochian magic, and more. Welcome to Episode 2, Her Dreaming Fingers. In this episode, we focus on composer, pianist, and author Katherine Ruth Heyman. Through Heyman, we explore the esoteric tradition of Theosophy and its role in American music. For Heyman, musical pitches corresponded to colors, vowels, the elements of nature, and the planets of the cosmos. Welcome to the astral plane. It was in 1875 when Madame Helena Petrovich Blavatsky founded the Theosophical Society. The influence that this spiritual philosophy would have in America, and notably on American music, was immense. Aided by Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, William Quan Judge, and others, Blavatsky sought to pioneer a spiritual philosophy which synthesized diverse esoteric traditions. Above all, and still today, Theosophy seeks to unite humanity with the aim of aiding the spiritual evolution of our species. It also seeks to research comparative religion and supernatural phenomena in order to gain a greater understanding of our human powers. It applies methods of meditation, visualization, and symbolic correspondences of the senses in pursuit of a direct connection with God or cosmic consciousness. Blavatsky emphasized that Theosophy was open to and included everyone, regardless of their earthly identity. Increasingly led by women, Theosophy embraced the women's suffrage movement and other social causes at the dawn of the 20th century.
The long fight was officially over. Born in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, the suffrage movement, in the words of leader Carrie Chapman Catt, was a long story of hard work and heartaches, but it was crowned by victory.
In 1920, women won the right to vote, and throughout the suffrage movement, women challenged the subservient roles foisted upon them by the American patriarchy. And it is during this time that we find many women unprecedentedly realizing their dreams and willing a better life for themselves and others. Social justice movements often find inspiration in esoteric traditions, and Theosophy's openness to race, color, sex, and creed became an empowering force for those otherwise marginalized in American society. Theosophy was also highly influential in the art world, especially with painting and music, encouraging creativity, experimentation, and self-transcending revelation. In the realm of music, we see this influence all over the early 20th century. And while there are many key musical figures, perhaps no one was more central than a pianist from Sacramento, California, Katherine Ruth Heyman. Katherine Ruth Heyman, known as Kitty to her close friends, was born on March 2, 1877. As a child, she studied piano with her father, and during her teens, she went to Europe, studying with renowned piano teachers in Berlin, Vienna, and London. After returning to the States, continuing further private studies, she joined the Boston Symphony Orchestra in 1899. She quickly became the talk of the town in the papers, both at home and abroad. In 1905, she sailed across the Atlantic again, this time for a solo tour, as well as sit-ins with most major orchestras. It was around this time that she met the much younger poet, Ezra Pound.
Rain, empty river, a voyage, fire from frozen cloud, heavy rain in the twilight. Under the cabin roof was one lantern, the reeds.
It was Heyman that introduced Pound to the esoteric philosophy that would significantly influence his work. She also rescued Pound from poverty, even paying him to be her tour manager. She set original music to Pound's poetry, while several of Pound's poems referred directly to Heyman. In his poem, Quinzane for this Yule, Pound writes, "Her dreaming fingers lay between the tunes, as when the living music swoons." Jealous of Heyman's influence on Pound, the poet Hilda Doolittle wrote Heyman into a derogatory character, Miss Stomberg, in her novel Hermione. Heyman and Pound's relation dissolved after a few years, as Pound fell in love with another esoteric artist, Olivia Shakespeare. Meanwhile, Heyman continued touring, beginning to have visions of color and psychic experiences as she played. She also continued exploring various esoteric philosophies. It seems she was taken by the Zen philosophy of Soke-an, who would go on to found the first Zen center in America in New York City, 1930. While working in London, Heyman met Sufi teacher Hazrat Inayat Khan, who wrote significant works on the relationship between music and spirituality. Expanding upon Khan's philosophy of listening, Heyman later wrote of there being 5 primary modes of listening to music: the common, the technical, the scientific, the emotional, and the mystical. Heyman would also explore Kabbalah, occult magic, spiritualism, as well as the yogi books of New Thought philosopher William Walker Atkinson, aka Yogi Ramacharaka. But Heyman's broader esoteric perspective came by way of Russian composer Alexander Scriabin, whom she met in 1913. Scriabin's music was almost entirely based in theosophical philosophy. And through Theosophy, Scriabin came to view divinity within himself. "I am God," he once proclaimed. He channeled unusual harmonies to express his divine inner world. This also led him to correspond musical pitches with the color spectrum, leading to the creation of color organs and vast multimedia concerts, such as his unfinished magnum opus, Mysterium, playing right now, which was to be a week-long multimedia healing event in the Himalayan mountains, a region revered in theosophical circles. Besides their brief meeting in person, Heyman claimed to have met Scriabin on the moon and had an affair with him there. And playing his music on the piano, she had visions of violet ships on golden oceans of astral ectoplasmic light. She became enthralled with him and devotionally engaged to the theosophical foundation of his music. By the mid-1920s, she was holding private salons and touring all Scriabin recitals in New York, and then again in the 1930s in Europe. And in 1934, Heyman founded the Scriabin Circle in New York City. "Appreciation of Scriabin," she wrote, "may mark the evolution of a nation's spiritual receptivity." Let's take a moment now to listen to a rare recording of Katherine Ruth Heyman playing Alexander Scriabin's 4th Piano Sonata. By her rigorous touring, lecturing, and esoteric promoting, she introduced not only Scriabin, but Theosophy to the who's who of American composers of the time. She inspired William Grant Still, Arthur Farwell, Dane Rudyard, Charles Ives, Ruth Crawford Seeger, each of whom found their own spiritual and often theosophical philosophy to guide their music. Composer Arthur Farwell recollected in a long article memorializing her death, "It is difficult to believe that Heyman was ever a child, or even a girl. Certain it was that she never became an old lady. She was ageless, like a sibyl, and like a sibyl, she had strange metaphysical and occult knowledge." Her esoteric perspective even impacted her piano students, including Jane Lavoie Hertz, John Kirkpatrick, Walter Morse Rummel, and Fabian Bowers. Bowers, who called Heyman the high priestess of the Scriabin cult, even went on to write a biography of Scriabin, describing the composer's music like this.
You see, Scriabin felt that the goal of his music was to be dematerialized, depersonalized, that music should be astral, it should be disembodied, it should be incorporeal. And that is called, now music of the human being, music in which the human is very much there, is hot. And he wanted this coldness, the coldness of outer space, in his last compositions.
And Bowers evocatively described Heyman as follows. Long before drugs made correlations between the senses commonplace, and decades before Zen, I Ching stick tossings, table tipping, Ouija boards, tarot cards, astrology, and the like became so very fashionable among our young, Kitty was a passionate convert and militant proselytizer, to and for all things recondite. But perhaps the most insightful look into the mind of Katherine Ruth Heyman is through a book that she published in 1921 called The Relation of the Archaic to Ultra-Modern Music. The book came about after Heyman gave a well-received series of lectures on music and esoteric spirituality. And though Scriabin is often foregrounded, Heyman clearly offered a much broader and more unique spiritual philosophy in her writing. She writes, "The senses, the tone, the planets, the vowels, ranged one against another, all 7 of them, would make an interesting playground for the artist who wished to practice a modern gematria and be really what the musician is called in India, the magician." In this work, Heyman proclaims that the new always has its origin in the archaic, and for her that meant specifically the esoteric philosophy of the ancient cultures. In a table in this book, she presents correspondences between planetary signs, perceptual and mental senses, vowels, and musical pitches. While the number 7 is revered in Theosophy, which works nicely with the 7 vowels, 7 planets, and 7 scale tones. Her chart of senses listed the following: taste, touch, smell, sight, hearing, the sense of sense, and a mystical knowledge she simply called the 7th. Heyman's correspondence system is similar to the Wu Jing philosophy of ancient Chinese music, which she acknowledges, while her 7-part framework is incidentally similar to the 8 forms of consciousness in Zen Buddhism. Interestingly, the one she is missing from the Zen model is diluted awareness. Heyman also applied her philosophy to analyze the works of other artists. When speaking of Scriabin, she applies her correspondence matrix to his harmonies. Speaking of one chord, she writes that it has the sun as its ruling factor, giving the tone its ancient seat of power. She applies the Sephiro from the Kabbalah to the formal organization of his sonatas. And she notes that in his 8th sonata, he derived 5 short melodies as, quote, runes of the 5 elements, drawn from the ritual music of the Kalisti sect in Russia. Stravinsky also drew musical inspiration from the Kalisti, heard here in his song Sundew. But to be sure, Heyman was one of the only artists at the time discussing music in this way and at the degree of depth, detail, and fervor that she did. For those interested to know more, I suggest you track down her text. Regardless, Heyman is one of the few American composers who confidently and actively promoted esoteric philosophy, self-empowerment, and intuitive experimentalism in American music during the early 20th century. And by the 1920s, the flame was being passed all over the continent. Thanks to figures like Heyman, American music would become radically inspired. Heyman's influence has seen little recognition with the passing of time. Today, she has been overshadowed by her male counterparts, largely known as a lover of Ezra Pound and the fanatic of Scriabin. Though primarily a pianist, Heyman was also a skilled composer, having composed songs as well as choral and symphonic works, many of which remain unrecorded. Meanwhile, Heyman's life shows how American experimentalism, from the ultra-modern to the avant-garde and beyond, is intimately tied to the influence of esoteric philosophy. Esoteric perspectives offered a means for those marginalized by race, gender, sex, and creed to find self-empowerment and personal revelation of a bigger world, one beyond the limitations of culture and the body. And Heyman today remains an unspoken pioneer of original strength during the women's suffragist movement and in influencing the course of American music. She passed away due to heart failure on September 29, 1944, at the age of 62. And before we go, let me leave you with Heyman's words. The new faculty or state of mind which is occasioning so much interest at the present time in the world belongs to the non-separated self. The seer and the artist have been ahead of the world. The world is catching up. The seer and the artist are still ahead, in that state of consciousness which produces in an artist the elimination of the sequential. Both self-righteousness and self-pity are left behind. I'm Matt Marble, and you've been listening to Secret Sound.
Now you have heard of women's rights and how we've tried to reach new heights. If we're all created equal, that's us too. But you will probably not recall that it's not been too long at all since we even had the right to cast a vote. Well, sure, some men bow down and call us misses. Let us hang the wash out and wash the dishes. But when the time rolled around to elect a president, what did they say, sister? What did they say? They said, see you later, and don't forget my mashed potatoes, cause I'm going downtown to cast my vote for president. Oh, we were suffering until suffering. Not a woman here could vote no matter what age. And the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule.